Classes now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the game between the Sharks and the Senators, in which the Sharks have lost 2-1 in overtime. So at the very least, I guess they get a point, which really only matters with keeping pace with the bottom of the Pacific, the Kings and the Ducks, trying to remain ahead of the Kings so that the pick that belongs to the Senators, the team they just played against, isn't necessarily as good as it could possibly be. The Senators, from their perspective, they didn't particularly care what occurred in this game, whether or not they would win or the Sharks would win. Both would be perfectly fine for them. Their worst case scenario was that this game would go to overtime, which it did, because they didn't want 3 points to be distributed. They would have rathered only 2. But in the end, I'm sure the Senators don't care. And the Sharks, well, they probably would have wanted to win, but 1 point is not all that bad, I guess. Now, the sad part is that this game was not played particularly well, and so if the Sharks actually showed up to play, they probably would have been able to beat the Senators, but yet here we are. First period started off, the Senators would get the first goal of the game. That would come from Nick Paul, his 9th of the season, which is a weird stat that he has a third of his goals on the year against the Sharks in just those 2 games. Okay. Then it would be Evander Kane with his 25th of the year late in the first period on the power play to tie it up. The second and third period would then pass with no goals scored between either teams, and not necessarily for a lack of opportunities, not necessarily for a lack of chances, because both of these teams, the Sharks and the Senators, both certainly gave away a lot of chances and then ended up gaining a lot of chances themselves, but they just really couldn't bury a lot of them. There were posts hit, there were pucks kicked into the net, there were pucks grabbed out of the crease and tossed away, there were wide open misses. But in the end, we would eventually go to overtime, where Dylan Gambrell and Joe Thornton would be sent onto the ice. Both would, for whatever reason, go to the goal line of the Senators zone. This would allow the Senators to get an easy 2-on-1. Brent Burns would play it poorly, and Chris Tierney, a former San Jose Shark, would score past Dell to get the extra point. First thing to talk about would be Dell, who had himself a pretty good game, I guess. Only letting in 2 goals is normally a good sign for a goaltender, but I do think a lot of it was due to some missed opportunities by the Senators, not necessarily from Dell making spectacular save here and there. In fact, there were a couple of times I thought Dell should have been able to have a puck, and there were a couple of times where I thought Dell probably shouldn't have given up a specific rebound. However, in the end, I guess it was still a decent game. You could definitely not blame Dell necessarily for the loss of this game, but this also wasn't one where Dell was, really putting the team on his back and somehow the Sharks let him down in some sort of way. No, he was good, but he wasn't fantastic. When it comes to the next start, it will of course be Martin Jones tomorrow, but for the start after that, we'll see how Jones does against Colorado. Whichever goaltender does best, I suspect, will get the following start. Even if Jones lets in, let's say, 3 goals against the Avalanche, I wouldn't be surprised to see Jones get the following start still. Next, I'll talk about team defense. Now, this is something that has really improved since Bob Booner has taken over from DeBoer. Same with the goaltending, of course. And I was going to point out just a couple of players here, but it really was just an all-around failure of the Sharks defensemen. I've talked about Burns and Shemek in the previous game against the Wild, that they had a fantastic game, basically mistakeless. Here tonight was not the case. Burns and Shemek both making some pretty big mistakes defensively. Vlasic and Heed as a pairing, this was put together for this game because Ferraro was out with an injury. Vlasic in particular was really bad in this one, so that was a bit disappointing to see. The Sharks defensive core really failed this game, and with, as I said, how poorly the game was played as a whole, the Sharks likely would have been able to take this game if they actually showed up, and it just wasn't really the case. Next, I'll talk about Dylan Gambrell. Noah Gregor, of course, had an opportunity on the first line with Kane and Couture for a few games. He ends up getting benched, healthy scratched. In this game, Gambrell is moved up to that top line, and there were maybe a couple of shifts where the 3 of them looked somewhat cohesive, but you could really tell that there wasn't much there. So eventually, as the game went on, Gambrell would get re-demoted, and LeBanc would be promoted to that first line, and immediately looked at least slightly better. LeBanc was on the 4th line this game because he got demoted from the 2nd line of Meyer and Thornton in the previous one against Minnesota. I don't think LeBanc should be in the bottom 6 at all, especially if you're the Sharks. You're trying to win games at the very least here in these last few games of the season. So getting LeBanc into that top 6 is probably what you want to do. I know maybe you're trying to send some sort of lesson here, but at this point, just put LeBanc into the top 6, so hopefully he will start the game with Kane and Couture, but I guess it's also possible Booner tries to trial another young player, maybe like a Bergman or something, in that spot for the following game. And finally, I'll talk about Sharks defenseman newcomer playing his first NHL game. Kuznetsov, I believe is how you pronounce it, if I'm not mistaken. Now, he was not very good at all. It seemed as though whenever I noticed him on the ice, he was making some sort of defensive mistake. It really reminded me of the first game of Jacob Middleton last season, where he was also making pretty big mistakes after mistake. And maybe it was nerves, maybe it was jitteriness or something like that, but it wasn't that great of a game here. It was actually kind of bad. And he made a few big mistakes. One of them led to a breakaway, just to name one. But we'll see what happens in the following game. Will he get back into the lineup for tomorrow, or will it be someone like Nick DeSimone, who I thought would get pushed into the lineup since there's been a lot of recalling from the San Jose Barracuda? Considering the game is tomorrow, I would be surprised to see Ferraro back into the lineup, but I guess that could also be something that happens. I guess we'll see, but that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow, as I said, against the Colorado Avalanche. If the Sharks show up with a similar performance as they had tonight against the Avalanche, they're likely to get crushed. They're lucky they were against the Senators, and so they only ended up losing in overtime. But show up against the Avalanche, who is actually a very good team, a playoff team looking to really make a potential push even for the Stanley Cup, they would get destroyed. So hopefully the Sharks can perform at least somewhat better in that one. Class dismissed.